Political assassinations in Mexico spill blood on the campaign trail. With dozens of candidates dead, are drug gangs gaining more power? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Mexico's deadly election season. Mexico's drug cartels are campaigning through the barrel of a gun. They're pushing their allies into office with threats and bloodshed. With at least 82 politicians killed since campaigning began last September, this election season has been called the worst in recent history. One mayoral candidate got an anonymous phone call that told her to drop out or die. While some political hopefuls won't greet voters without their bulletproof vests and bodyguards, others are just shying away from the limelight. And it's not just the candidates who are being threatened. Voter turnout is expected to drop to an all-time low this July. So, are drug gangs killing Mexico's democracy? Randolph Nogel has more.
The banner says, "Forever my candidate." But Ulysses Fabian Quiros is one of at least 82 candidates and office holders who will never see Election Day. Like Quiros, most were running for positions in local government. But before voters could decide, drug gangs intervened to make sure their contender was the only one left on the ballot. To run for office without the endorsement of a local cartel in Mexico is now considered an act of bravery.
There have been a series of continuous attacks and harassment that has been difficult to cope with at times. However, this does not intimidate me, nor does it take away my passion to continue to participate. Because people have told me, don't get pushed aside, keep going. We have to go forward.
Almost 3,500 positions are up for grabs on July 1st. The most ever for a single day of voting.
In this electoral process, we are willing to provide the greatest protection and the greatest possible conditions to those who request it, to those who feel the need for it.
But in the many remote provinces that lie far outside the political center of Mexico City, candidates have little protection. Endemic corruption has lent impunity to drug gangs, paid for in bribes to security forces.
The countryside has been abandoned. The response has been that there's no money. There is money. The problem is that public money is stolen.
On the national stage, presidential opponents spar with each other.
With your ambition for power and your fear of losing again, you have become a puppet for criminals. I will put them in jail.
All are promising change, with special consideration paid to a challenge that has plagued the outgoing presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto.
Corruption is Mexico's main problem. Nothing has hurt the country more than the dishonesty of those governing.
Whoever takes the reins will have to find a national solution to a ubiquitous problem. One paid for in blood by those who dare to try and escape the influence of Mexico's powerful drug gangs. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our guest now from Mexico City is John Ackerman. He's a law professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Also in Mexico's capital is the editor of El Heraldo newspaper, Jose Carreño. And joining us from the city of Guadalajara is former government advisor, Rodrigo Aguilar. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. John Ackerman, let me begin with you. Why are candidates being killed in such a way?
Well, because we have a generalized crisis of the rule of law of Mexico for the last 10 years. Mexico has been turned into a bloodbath in general. Ever since the militarized drug war began in 2006, very much imposed by Washington, the United States, and embraced by the last two presidents, Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto, Mexico has become a very violent place. And of course, narcos need political protection now more than ever before. And so there's complicity, and there is an attack directly on the political sphere so as to assure control over specific geographic areas. It's interesting that most of the violence has been against local politicians.
Right.
National politicians have not been affected yet, and this speaks directly to the issue of geographic control over narco routes.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're looking at all these multiple local offices all over the place. Rodrigo Aguilar, if you're a local politician, what do you have to do or say to not get killed by the narcos?
Well, it's very hard to tell because, as John already said, the whole situation in Mexico in terms of violence against local communities is widespread all across the country. Of course, there are more geographically located zones that are more dangerous than others. But if I were a mayor and I would be in danger, I would probably have to cancel my candidacy or to try to find a protection from the state. But again, it is very hard to tell. It is a risky business to be a local candidate in some areas, especially those who are controlled by the drug dealers. And it's a very risky profession. I mean, so far we've been also having a lot of journalists killing during the last 10 years. We have around 200, 250 journalists. So that is also a profession that is at stake with all this violence.
Yeah. Jose, are they ultimately in control, given that they control life or death, and the fact that as a candidate you have to either align yourself with the narcos, especially on the local level, or you'll be dead? Does that mean that the narcos control the society?
No, I wouldn't say that. Most of the candidates that have been killed at this point have been killed in very small communities or relatively small communities. There is a very difficult situation. We do not know exactly how much the narcos have gone into the political body of the country, and we do not know exactly how much or how far the killings are only by narcos, because some of the murders have been done more for reasons that have with other groups of delinquency, as oil stealers, or by local reasons like in the community problems in Oaxaca. So there is, it is not exactly all narco thing, but there is a lot of it.
Right, but Jose, given that 82 were killed, and when we have the election, there's 3,400 local government seats up for grabs to fill up Congress and the Senate, it adds up, right? These are not high-profile politicians, but it adds up. If you say at least half of those killings even had to do with smuggling routes, at least half of those killings, I'm being conservative here, had to do with the narcos controlling a particular place, add it all together, doesn't that mean that a large part of the society is being controlled by narcos?
Absolutely. I have no problem accepting that. The problem is nobody knows exactly how far and how large. The problem is, how do you measure it? The problem is, how can you cope with it, and how can the political body control it? It is, it is a menace, it's a threat to society, it's a threat to the political body, it's a threat to democracy, but at the same time, we do not know exactly how far is it, because so far at this point, is relatively located to smuggling routes.
Right.
So that makes a difference.
Right. John Ackerman, is the state unable to or unwilling to put an end to this?
Well, that's a big question, because especially in the context of the elections coming up, as you mentioned, this is one of the biggest elections, perhaps the biggest election in recent Mexican history, with over 3,000 posts up for dispute, a major presidential election. The context is very important because we have this incredible citizen uprising, the peaceful uprising against the sitting government, against the authoritarian system, which is Mexico today, a real struggle for democracy from civil society. Trying to make these elections into a real democratic transition in Mexico, which we have not undergone. Even though people speak of a democratic transition, Mexico continues to be an authoritarian system. And the big question is whether the narcos are already, and may even more, play a role in trying to shut down this citizen hope. And like you mentioned in the introduction, trying to, for instance, reduce citizen participation in the voting, citizen Voting has typically been between 50-60% in the presidential elections. The hope is that in these presidential elections, it could get up to 70%. And that could be good news for democratic transition. But if the narcos play in along with the authoritarian system, and that's not just at the local level, that's at the national level, this could be a real risk for democracy this July 1st.
Yeah, interesting that you say that it is an authoritarian system in your opinion. Rodrigo, let me ask you, have these killings dented or damaged Mexican democracy?
Well, of course, in a very deep way since Presidente Calderón took office in 2006. But what I will say that killed more the democracy of my country is the corruption and the level of impunity and the absence of the rule of law. I will say that combination is even worse than the killings of the drug. And I will explain a little bit more. It is unthinkable that in 2018, we are experiencing another campaign of fear. The ghost of the electoral fraud is also a part of the conversation today. So that sort of, those sort of, elements in this election will turn this election a very historic one and an election as no other. The democracy in Mexico is at peril. Of course it is. But I will say that after the election in July 1st, we will be a different country whoever wins the Mexican presidency.
Jose Carreño, is it a part of that corruption that so few people have been arrested or convicted for killing politicians?
I think that both problems feed each other. If you have a group, a narco group, let's say, controlling a region, and they control the local authorities, of course they will have impunity. And that feeds their own sense of power and their own sense of invulnerability. So if you have these regions all over the country, that makes a big amount, and yes, that is a real problem. It is the kind of issue that is turning up the electorate in Mexico. And as Javier is right, it is, at this point, probably corruption and impunity are the biggest issues in the election, and probably also the largest issues to be debated in the country.
John, something that blew my mind while I was doing my reading for this segment, in the state of Guerrero, the Roman Catholic bishop, Salvador Angel Mendoza, held a Good Friday summit with the cartel leaders, begging them not to kill politicians ahead of the election. What does that tell you about Mexican democracy? What does that tell you about where the power lies? And maybe the possible solutions to this, that maybe it doesn't have to do with government. Maybe it takes, I don't know, the church leaders to sort things out.
Well, the first part, definitely, this speaks to a very serious crisis in the institutions and rule of law in Mexico, of course. The corruption and violence and these assassinations in general are intimately linked. The reason why the government does not investigate these crimes is because many of the investigators themselves, and I insist not just at the local level, but also at the national level, are implicit one way or another. Cifra negra, the black, how do you say it in English? I'm forgetting English. The number of crimes that are actually reported to the authorities is only 9%. So 91% of crimes are not even reported to the authorities, and of those who are reported, only 2/3 of them are actually investigated. So 94% of crimes in Mexico are not even investigated. And this speaks to, on one hand, the ineptness of the government institutions, but also lack of trust of the people in the authorities. They go to present a crime to the investigators, and often it turns against them. The investigators who are in the pockets of the criminals themselves turn around and start investigating the victims themselves. So we have an institutional crisis. Now, the issue or the idea that the church might be the solution, I think this is absolutely, in this drastic case, this is what's happening in Guerrero. But in general, in Mexico, we've had a very clear, perhaps it's the country which has the most clear separation between church and state since the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917, the Constitution of 1917. The church has been totally excluded from politics. We need to find some other way of regenerating society and politics. And these elections on July 1st, I think, are a great opportunity. If Mexico is allowed to have a democratic election that would lead to stronger institutions, because if the institutions, the new politicians, are indebted to and accountable to the people, really, and not to electoral fraud, as Javier mentioned, is very much a reality today in Mexico. Very frequently in local elections and also federal elections, there is fraud. And the real struggle for July 1st is to have a legitimate election and a president who is actually elected by the people, who can use that legitimacy to impose and establish a rule of law.
Jose Carreño, how free and fair will those elections be?
I think it will be a lot more fairer and freer than what is being suggested. But that is my personal belief. It is the government, the state has made a huge investment in the Instituto Nacional Electoral, and I do not believe that the way that it has been working is a fraud is possible. However, somebody mentioned the vote of fear. Somebody mentioned this kind of, let's say, the ways to trying to influence the vote of the population, which are not exactly democratic. And yes, I believe that there are trials, attempts to the vote of fear. However, I do not see, perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I do not see the possibilities of political fraud in the urns or in the election itself.
Well, I can never have a guest who's too optimistic, so it's good to have you on. Rodrigo Aguilar, let me ask you about the war on drugs. There's a theory that applies to Mexico as well as Colombia as well. It's that with the war on drugs, with the help of Washington, by taking out kingpins, so for example, in Mexico's case, perhaps El Chapo, these gangs splinter and bifurcate, and it almost makes it worse. It's actually much easier to fight the narcos when they're just under one big cartel, and more difficult given that there's a proliferation all over the country. Is that part of the problem?
Well, that was basically the failed strategy that President Calderon did in 2006. That was exactly the reason why the Mexican war on drugs became so badly terrible in terms of violence. But you know what? I think we haven't talked about the sources of what is actually fueling the violence in Mexico.
What is it?
Inequalities, the extreme poverty that we have in Mexico. Of course, the absence of the rule of law. Those are conditions that, for example, anthropologist Carlos Montemayor used to say that if you are a really poor guy in Mexico, you have only three choices. You either migrate to the United States, you start your own business in the informal economy, or you get involved in the drug business. So those are the options that the really poor people have in Mexico. So those are the sources of what is happening right now in Mexico. So we need, of course, to tackle those sources, income inequality, poverty, and so on.
John Ackerman, very finally, do you agree with that? To solve this problem, you have to solve the whole society.
Inequality yes, inequality is one of the major issues. Mexico has, almost, depending on how you measure, 60 million people below the poverty line. About half of the population is in poverty, and this makes them very vulnerable to the narco traffickers. Just one other note in terms of this campaign of fear mentioned by Jose Carreño. Just yesterday, the candidate from the ruling party, Jose Antonio Meade, released a new television advertisement against the principal opposing politician, López Obrador, who is also way ahead in the polls. And this advertisement, 30-second advertisement, you should look it up, as your viewers can find it easily, is an absolutely aggressive portrayal, making up relationships between López Obrador and, burning vehicles, violence in the streets. There's this, very intense effort by the government, because this is the ruling party's candidate, to create this context of fear and violence so that people do not go out in the polls. So once again, this is the big question. Are these narcos really willing to play the game of the authoritarian government, or are they willing to stand aside, at least at the federal level, for these elections? That's going to be something to watch running up towards July 1st.
Okay, fascinating. I've learned a lot, gentlemen. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. John Ackerman, Jose Carreño, and Rodrigo Aguilar. Coming up on the Newsmakers, is Iran gearing up to ban the country's most popular mobile messaging app? And could the Netherlands' euthanasia laws lead to murder charges? Days after Russia clamped down on the popular mobile messenger Telegram, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei announced that he's shutting down his personal account. He says he's doing so to safeguard the national interest. Activists interpreted his announcement to mean the app will soon be banned. 40 million Iranians use Telegram, and hardline politicians say government critics use it to organize protests. With more on this, here's Sandra Gatman.
Iranians are plugging into cyberspace at what seems like record speed. Millions of people are logging on to socialize, run businesses, and get informed. But it's also heavily surveilled. Iran's telecoms industry is entirely state-owned. Still, one social media platform seems to reign supreme. It's called Telegram.
Telegram is used not just as a messaging app, but as really a social media outlet for buying things, for selling things, for sharing news, and of course for political campaigning. I can tell you that my grandmother is on Telegram, as are many Iranian grandmothers.
Nearly 50 million Iranians, nearly half the population, are thought to use the app.
Telegram has taken off in Iran unlike anywhere else in the world. One reason is that messaging services like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Viber have all been blocked. But Telegram also has strong security features like strong encryption and self-destructing messages, keeping communication safe from Iranian intelligence. Users can also create supergroups, essentially broadcasting content to tens of thousands of people.
Channels like Monoto, a satellite media company critical of Iran's government, have a huge audience on Telegram. But the messenger's plans to develop an online marketplace has Iran's rulers worried. The country's cyberspace chief says Telegram will undermine the national currency of Iran. He also described it as an enemy of the private sector. Other hardliners, including the Ayatollah himself, are calling for Telegram to be replaced by domestic services like Sarush. Its selling points? Total user privacy, according to the government, and even a death to America emoji. This week, Iran's supreme leader and several top officials quit Telegram, urging all civil servants to follow suit, a sign, many suspect, of things to come. The Iranian authorities got their first wake-up call over Telegram's potential last year. December's anti-government protests were largely organized on the messaging app. Iran's ruling elite also accused its users of promoting violence and vandalism, and Telegram was blocked for 2 weeks. But the platform might have one important champion, President Hassan Rouhani. Many believe he won a landslide election thanks to his progressive campaigns on Telegram and Instagram as he battled conservative candidates favored by state TV. Rouhani recently posted this.
Breaking monopolies and backing the domestic messaging apps does not mean imposing restrictions on other social media platforms. People preserve the right to choose, and they can simultaneously use various social media platforms.
What might also save Telegram in Iran is the very real risk that blocking it for good will lead to exactly the kind of uprising the government is trying so hard to prevent. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Said Mustafa Hoshcheshim. He's a media professor at the University of Tehran. And in the studio with me is journalist Borzu Daragahi. Good to have you back on the show, Borzu, and welcome to the show, Mustafa Hoshcheshim. Let me begin with you. Alauddin Boroujerdi, the chairman of the National Security Commission, said that Telegram is a threat to national security. Isn't he overreacting a little bit?
Hello, and thanks for having me on the show. Well, no, of course not. You know, Iran has been under the constant threat of regime change plans all throughout the last 4 decades. it has come under attack. It has come, under various plots, regime change plots, like sanctions, velvet revolutions, coup d'etats, and so on and so forth. And Iran's enemies, the United States and Israel, have admittedly been using the cyberspace to hit Iran. The world was in an environment of cybersecurity before 2007, but it experienced a transition to a cyber war environment because of attacks on Iran by malwares such as Stuxnet, Doko, Son of Doko, and others. So when you can see that cyberspace is used by Iran's enemies to enforce regime change, there is no reason to believe that they have stopped doing so, and they have admitted that they've stated repeatedly that they are using the cyberspace and messaging applications, including Telegram, whose servers are outside Iran, in order to provoke the Iranian public, and they did that a few months ago.
Okay, so let me ask Borzo then.
The big
fair
data
enough.
transition that's not now under Iran's control.
Fair enough. So Borzo, so we have Mustafa Hoshcheshem making the argument that outside forces are using the app to instigate the society, ignite the society against the government. Is any of that plausible?
I mean, I think that underestimates the intelligence and subjectivity of the Iranian people, who make their own decisions about what to get upset about and what to be angry about. These messaging apps are tools. Not only are they tools, they're tools that are used by the Supreme Leader, for example, has his own Telegram channel. The Revolutionary Guards have a Telegram channel. The Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, which is the sort of secretive operations abroad, have a Telegram channel. They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, yet these tools are denied ordinary Iranian people. And now they're talking about shutting down Telegram, which is used by 50 million Iranian people to communicate.
Right. So let me then ask you, are they trying to shut it down because they fear outside forces, or rather are they trying to shut it down because they don't want internal dissent?
I think that there is a debate within the regime. It's not just black and white. For example, the president that was elected twice by a majority of the Iranian people has said that he doesn't want to shut down Telegram. But there are dark and more sinister and more totalitarian elements within the elite of the regime who want to shut Iran off from the rest of the world, who want to be able to control and monitor Iranians' every activities, including what they say and do online. And it's for that reason that certain elements in the regime, not all of them, just a very small, cliquish, cultish elite, have this illusion that they can control all the people.
Mustafa Hoshcheshem, by supporting the blocking of Telegram, you're supporting totalitarianism.
No, first of all the channels that my colleague stated at the studio, they have all been shut down voluntarily by the leader, by the IRGC and others. You know that the same Telegram messaging application, Iranians have been talking to its owner, Pavel Durov, in order to have some kind of cooperation after the Telegram application was used from abroad by various channels, including Ahmad News, who were teaching people how to make Molotov cocktails. That's a bomb. That's considered terrorism by any standard. And they taught people how to do that during the recent unrest. So who is going to answer for that?
Again,
and Paul Durov
there's an underestimation of the Iranian people,
despite the fact that all the world countries.
I'm a kid who grew up in the U.S. I knew how to make a Molotov cocktail when I was 9 years old. It's not a very complicated thing. To say that Iranians need a Telegram to learn how to use how to make and use a Molotov cocktail that any person in the world anywhere can make with any household goods is just absurd, and it underestimates, it infantilizes the Iranian people.
Okay, Mustafa Hoshcheshem.
I was not the I was about to explain that this is happening everywhere. India shut down WhatsApp. France has very recently warned to ban both Telegram
this is the thing. If
and
other
WhatsApp.
people do it, does that make it right?
Russia has shut down.
Certainly, we debate that. The FSB tried to hack into Telegram.
Let me explain.
So my
let me explain.
point to you
let
is
me
that
explain.
Does it make it
Would you
right,
please let
sir?
me let me explain about that. This is not something unique to Iran. When it comes to Iran, there are so many hues and cries. Iran has not banned Instagram. It has not warned to close down WhatsApp. They are both working in Iran, but the same concerns are felt even at the U.S. Congress, at the House of the Lords and the House of the Commons in the UK, where they summoned the owner of Facebook, or the manager of the Facebook, in order to explain how he misled the public into Brexit and in the recent election in the United States. So
Facebook
everyone knows that the people are misled.
Certainly.
I think these issues are worth discussing.
Okay, fair enough.
I think they're worth discussing at a regulatory level. I think they're worth discussing at a democratic kind of setting where people talk about these
So you don't believe
these
there's a
tools.
democratic setting?
I don't believe that there's a democratic setting in Iran
This
when
is just
an elected
propaganda.
government that has been elected twice on a platform of liberalizing social media usage gets shut down by a bunch of
lid on that just for a second.
A little clique of people who are entrenched inside the regime.
Okay, got the point. Let me put a lid on that just for a second to both of you. And it's interesting that more than 40 million people in Iran use Telegram. More than 500,000 people depend on it to actually generate income, which is an interesting thing. And what I've learned, unlike, say, the WhatsApp groups that my auntie creates, on Telegram, there's an unlimited number of people you can actually add to your groups, which I think could be one of the reasons why WhatsApp is not touched, because you can add hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to Telegram groups, right? Let me look at potential solutions here, Borzu Daragahi. What we have is Ayatollah Khamenei coming out with a fatwa. It came out on Twitter, it was on the website and on Twitter, saying invading users' privacy on social media is religiously forbidden, and we're hearing of something called surush. So the Iranians are saying, okay, we don't like Telegram, we feel it's not quite right, we're going to create our own. Why don't you give them a chance?
I think that there should be a surush, and Iranians should have a chance to use that. But they're already ideologizing it. They're creating emojis that have "Death to America" on them. They're creating, they're already branding this new product with the accoutrement of the hardline faction in the regime. And so, I think that Iranians should have a choice. Do they want to use Telegram? Do they want to use Signal? Do they want to use, whatever? Do they want to go on Facebook, which they don't have a choice? It's filtered out. It's blocked out. So I think it's great that the Iranian regime wants to launch its own messaging app. Let them compete head-to-head and see who does better.
Okay, so Mustafa Hoshcheshim, give the Iranian people a choice. Isn't that reasonable?
More than a dozen applications have recently started working. None of them is governmental except for one, and they have all been absorbing people. More and more members they are getting from the Iranian community. It's not just the security. There are economic merits, and there are many other aspects of using various applications. It's very, illogical to say that just let me explain this example. If your kid is kidnapped by a person and there has been some kind of private chat between these two, the abductor and also the person, the kid, on the Telegram, if you ask Pavel Durov to provide the chats, he says no, and the servers are not in Iran. So how would you feel in that case if your kid is stolen, kidnapped by a person, and Durov and Telegram could help, but they avoid helping them?
I mean, if you get a subpoena,
there are many reasons for shutting down Telegram in Iran.
Of course, there are many order and a subpoena,
there are many reasons for shutting down.
I mean, they just want to shut down. They just want to quiet. They just want to silence.
That.
This has been going on for 40 years now. And what it's really about is the Iranian hardliners' fear of any connections between the Iranian people and people abroad in the diaspora and other parts of the world. It's not just about Telegram. It's about Facebook as well. It's about satellite television, which they've also tried to shut down with using various technologies
or
that
at least with regard to Facebook, apparently Americans share the same feeling. Apparently Americans share the same feeling with regard to Facebook because they are also worried about that. And the UK is also worried about that. People are misled by them. And how come when Twitter is operating in Germany, the deputy leader of one of the ultra-right parties, he says that he doesn't know why the police is so kind to Muslims in his country. And the German government asks Twitter to shut down the page, and they do it. And then he goes on Facebook releases the same message. The German government asks Facebook to do the same, and they do it. They comply with the rules. But when it comes to Iran, no one complies with the rules because they are using these messaging applications as a means to enforce regime change and to go on with their own dreams in Iran. There are many ways to connect abroad. It's not just Telegram. Okay. There are many other ways to send videos and sounds and information.
Okay, so everybody
Iran
else
has not want to shut them down.
So everybody else is tightening the noose. Why are you picking on Iran, Borzul?
I'm not picking on Iran at all. You know, I was asked to comment on Iran. I'm a journalist. I am, as you are, I'm an advocate for freedom of speech, and I am instinctively opposed to any attempts by governments to shut down on those tools. Now, if democratic societies want to have a debate about regulating certain tools, if there's certain unethical practices that these companies engage in, if they are, for example, hindering an investigation into child abuse, yes, there should be consequences and recourses. But for a government, not just a government, for a clique of people who have been entrenched, who are not elected, haven't been elected ever, to impose on an elected government, the government of President Hassan Rouhani, which has twice been re-elected with majorities, to impose on that government rules which the people clearly are against, without any kind of debate, without any kind of public forum, is just wrong.
Okay, I mean, one thing I'll add to this is when I downloaded Telegram, all the Iranians I knew were at the top of the list on Telegram. Not all of them were on WhatsApp, but they all were on Telegram. It shows you Iranians love Telegram. They might not have it for much longer, given the current trends. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Sayed Mustafa Hoshcheshem and Borzul Daragahi, I thank you for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
If you have to say goodbye, it's much better to do it in the right way. I don't want a prolonged sickbed or a slow descent into dementia. I've seen that too much around me. I find that so humiliating. I just don't want that.
The Netherlands leads the world in access to euthanasia, but critics have long argued that assisting patients with suicide will lead to abuses from healthcare professionals, and now a new police investigation might support their fears. It's the first criminal investigation since the Dutch legalized euthanasia in 2002. Authorities are looking into 5 cases, including allegations that a doctor drugged a patient's coffee, a woman was physically restrained while getting a lethal injection, and 2 Alzheimer's patients were euthanized without giving legal consent. Well, to discuss this, let's bring in our panel. From Amsterdam, we have Dr. Rob Jonquiere. He's the Executive Director of the World Federation of Rights to Die Societies. And in Utrecht, we have Medical Ethics Professor Theo Boer. And in Southampton, UK, the spokesman for the group Care Not Killing, Alistair Thompson. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Theo Boer, let me begin with you. What's your response to those who say that euthanasia and assisted suicide should be a human right?
I think I have some understanding for that question. But what I think is that when you try to organize that as a country, you will probably get in trouble. And what I mean by that is that we in the Netherlands have had experience for about 40 years of discussing and tolerating this. And what we have seen is that the situation is getting practically out of control. One of the things is that the numbers have more than tripled since we had the euthanasia law. Another thing and we still see no end in the increase. Another thing is that the number of reports, 23% of the euthanasia cases is still not reported. And furthermore, what you see is that the reasons for euthanasia, they keep getting bigger. From the beginning, it was terminal illnesses, just as we can all imagine, cancer in a terminal stage. And now we are talking about people with years to live. And I think that we are getting into a culture in which death is too often seen as the final solution to all our suffering.
Okay, so Rob Jonquiere, when we look at situations where people have late stages of dementia, it's almost impossible to find out what they actually want, and they're being euthanized. When we look at the case of the 19-year-old girl who ordered substance X from the internet and she died, she effectively killed herself legally. It's not hard to see that Theo has a point, right?
Well, I understand why Theo is saying these kind of things, and it is, of course, as always, it is the music the tone which makes the music. I disagree with Theo in the way that it is getting out of control, and I even can say that just by the fact that now this year the prosecuting have started to do investigation into a couple of cases is just proof of the transparency and the carefulness we practice our euthanasia in the Netherlands.
Okay, so Alistair Thompson.
Hold on,
Rob, just for a second, right? I want to bring in Alistair Thompson. Alistair Thompson, there are laws on the books against murder. If you're a doctor who wants to be like Hannibal Lecter and you want to kill your patients, there'll be an investigation, people will find out, and you'll be tried and convicted of murder, right? It's not to say that you can hide it behind euthanasia, right, Alistair?
No, I fundamentally disagree, and what we've seen is that those people choosing to end their lives are often susceptible to pressure, whether perceived or real, into ending their lives. If you look at some of the other jurisdictions which have done detailed work on why people are choosing to end their lives, I'm referring particularly to the state of Washington and Oregon in the US, over half of in both states of those people who are ending their lives do so because they fear becoming a burden on their families or caregivers. And I would suspect that the research in the Netherlands is probably very similar, because what we're seeing is, as rightly has been pointed out, it's a dramatic increase from 2002, when under 2,000 people were euthanized in the Netherlands, to 2017, when 6,500 people were euthanized in the Netherlands, including quite a large number, 169 people who were suffering from dementia and over 80 people with psychiatric conditions.
So, Rob, would you accept a tightening of restrictions to make it less easy for people to be euthanized? So the principle is still there, but the abuse is tackled.
Well, the point is, I won't accept it because I don't think it is an abuse. If you talk about, for example, from the UK now, you talk about 169 cases of dementia. It is only 3 cases which are late dementia, and the others are just people who suffer. And the core principle of our law is about suffering. It is not about terminal illness or starting to die. It is the suffering which is important. And people getting in the early stages of dementia are very capable of making decisions like this.
Theo Boer, would you accept that it's still a way to end terrible suffering of people who are really feeling a lot of pain, and that this still is a solution for some?
Yes, I absolutely think that euthanasia can be a solution to some, but the extent that it has taken in the Netherlands, and I think Mr. Jonquiere, how much I respect him, but he denies the seriousness of the rise of the numbers, you see, because not only have the euthanasia numbers risen, but also the numbers of suicides, unlike in other countries surrounding us. Germany went down 10% in suicides, and the Netherlands, which have euthanasia, went up by 37%. So there is a culture of death that is coming in our country, which I do not like.
Rob, is there a culture of death, and are you denying the seriousness of this escalation?
Well, I don't agree with Theo that there is a connection between the suicide numbers and the numbers of euthanasia. Of course, if you see it as part of a culture of deaths, then I agree that what he's saying. But you can also say that because we have a euthanasia law which is working quite good, actually, you may agree with it or not, but it is working very careful and good. This makes it possible for people to talk about dying and talk about the way they want to die or make choices how to die. And that is also a reason why, because patients are more susceptible to talking about dying, about the way to dying, and doctors have been getting used to applying euthanasia. That is one of the reasons why the number is rising. But I don't think this is just a normal, natural way of rising.
Okay, so you see the escalation as natural. Alistair, let me bring you in here. A lot of people are talking about it openly. Not everybody is in the late stages of dementia. A lot of them are very confident and have their faculties all intact when they say, this is what I want to do. I want to be helped along the way to death. Would you accept that people have a fundamental right to go ahead with that?
No, because I think when you look at the evidence, so in 2009, the Royal College of Physicians provided evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, who were looking at the suicide law in Britain. And they very clearly said that it's important, if someone is feeling suicidal, if someone is feeling depressed, that they have support and help and are not given, and I paraphrase terribly, the keys to the drugs cabinet to kill themselves. That is why when the House of Lords in the UK looked at this issue, they said there is no safe system of assisted suicide or euthanasia anywhere in the world. And when MPs voted on this issue again in the UK in 2015, by a whopping majority, they rejected any changes, any weakening in the UK law, which is a prohibition on both assisted suicide and euthanasia.
So, Alistair, is there any condition in which you would, or under which you would actually accept assisted suicide or euthanasia?
No, and I think for very, very clear reasons, because of the pressure that people can feel under because of becoming a burden on their families, a burden on the system. It's important that we have a very clear law, which is we will not help you to die. What we need to do in this country, and we have a massive a problem in the healthcare system which is very strapped for money at the moment, is a debate about how we're going to pay for that. And an ageing population brings in massive challenges. In a couple of decades' time, in the UK alone, we're going to have about 800,000 people with dementia. Now, I believe, and Care Not Killing believes, that we need to answer fundamental questions about caring for them, rather than saying the simple solution is to introduce euthanasia or assisted suicide.
Rob Jonquiere, what do you think Alistair doesn't understand about your argument?
I agree completely with Alistair that if you have a growing number of dementia, and we have the same in the Netherlands, if one of the first issues to look for is to having good care for those people who get demented. The second thing is that, of course, in all the discussions, it looks as if the demented patient says, I want to die, and they just get their euthanasia. Don't forget that the law in the Netherlands says there must be a request from a patient who is capable, have a capacity to say that, and the doctor who has to apply the aid in dying has to agree with it, and is only going to agree with it if he can feel with the patient that the choice the patient makes is the right choice. So that is an extra thing you never hear in the discussions about, that there is still this doctor who has to agree with it. And I can assure you, having practiced euthanasia myself as a family doctor, that it is one of the most difficult things you have to do as a doctor, and you rather try to avoid that decision.
Okay, so Theo Boer, as a final comment here on our panel. We've spoken a lot about the Netherlands, we've spoken a little bit about the United States, a lot about the UK. Theo, is there anywhere in the world right now where you think, in your opinion, they have the balance, that they're doing it right?
I think that some countries, such as Victoria and Australia, are doing a better job by having more strict criteria. But I would say if you consider legalizing, look to the Netherlands and you will see your own future within 20 years. I have seen postal code areas where 10 to 12% of all mortality was euthanasia. Now, Dr. Jonquiere, I know that it is a very hard decision for a doctor, but 10 to 12% of all mortality cases being euthanasia is no longer an exception.
Okay, gentlemen, we're out of time. I'd love to continue because this is really fascinating. It's really interesting, but I have to move on. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Rob, Jonquiere, Theo Boer, and Alistair Thompson. All the best.
Century after this campaign was fought. It is humbling to stand among our New Zealand and Turkish friends and reflect on the service and sacrifice of the tens of thousands of people on both sides of the campaign who lost their lives.
Ortak acıları yeni düşmanlıklar üretme değil, dostluğun, sevginin, barışın aracı haline dönüştürme konusunda Çanakkale'nin tüm dünyaya.
And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, the World Health Organization marks Immunization Week. We look at why some are still afraid of life-saving vaccines. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.